News, discussions and analysis. This is SITREP.
If we weren't all so busy looking at Ukraine, we might have heard a little more in the last couple of weeks about Abu Dhabi. Not a renowned conflict spot, but this week 2 ballistic missiles were fired at the capital of the United Arab Emirates. They were, though, shot down by defence forces. However, a week before, 3 people were killed by drone strikes on oil tankers near Abu Dhabi airport. Houthi rebels in Yemen say they carried out the attacks because of the UAE's involvement in Yemen's 7-year civil war. Well, Dr. Andreas Krieg is a senior security studies lecturer at King's College London. Good to speak to you today. The UAE has been scaling back in Yemen. It withdrew significant numbers of forces in 2019. It pulled out of southern Hodeidah at the end of last year. Why has it been attacked now?
Well, I mean, there is a bit of a misperception here. I mean, first of all, the civil war has been going on for far longer than 2015. And the UAE's involvement that started really in 2015 as part of the Saudi-led coalition hasn't really come to an end. I mean, the Saudis and the Emiratis have continuously engaged and are engaging in Yemen. And what the UAE have done, particularly in the south of the country, they have delegated most of the burden of warfare to surrogates. So they have never really fully withdrawn. They've just delegated that burden to proxy forces that they've been training, and there's still UAE officers on the ground to do training and direction on the ground. So, you know, the claim and the argument that the Emiratis have made that they are no longer in Yemen has been basically false. They have been and are still part of that conflict, and are now for the very first time are held to account for their involvement in war crimes and crimes against humanity on the ground.
The Yemen civil war has largely disappeared from British headlines, but it continues. Can you give us a quick overview of the state of play at the moment?
I mean, it's a very complex multipolar conflict across a variety of different fault lines, tribal, north-south sectarian fault lines, as well as a range of political fault lines as well. So the conflict is very protracted, and with every escalation that we see, the protraction gets more complex because certain groups are splitting up. But, you know, there are 3 major parties that are really competing. In the north, it's the Houthis, which have, become known as somewhat one of the proxies of Iran, but are an indigenous Yemeni player. Then we have the Hadi government, supported by the Saudis, which is supported by the UN as well, which has become really a very, very weak player, to be honest. And then we've got the Southern Transitional Council, supported by the UAE. All of them are quasi-state actors. All of them have their own security sectors, and they all fight each other. And then we have a variety of different fringe groups that are also part of the mix. So the humanitarian crisis has really been exacerbated by the fact that all these different groups are fighting, and there isn't really any point of stability in this conflict.
Joe Biden ended support for the Saudi-led coalition fighting the Houthis nearly a year ago. Has that made any difference?
No, not at all. Because, the Americans are part of the conflict as well, because of Iran's involvement on the ground. This has always been something that the Americans were very sensitive about. Trump administration, Obama administration, and the Biden administration. And then there is obviously always the looming threat of, violent extremist actors on the ground that, most Western countries, including the UK, find highly problematic. I mean, Al-Qaeda has been a very, very strong player and remains a very strong player in Yemen. So, the conflict has always been delegated from the West to local forces. So I think the UK and the US were somewhat happy that part of that burden of that very complex conflict is now being shared with local Gulf countries who, to be honest, are not really up to the task. So the debate that we're having in Western capitals about how much support are we giving to the Saudis or the Emiratis is a bit phony, considering that we actually want them to take over that burden because we don't want to do it ourselves.
You describe a very bleak situation in Yemen. Is there any hope for peace in the near future? And if so, what is the best hope?
The only really solution as to any conflict, if you want a proper solution, a comprehensive solution, is a political one, which means all the parties need to be around the table. And there has been a process post the revolution in 2011 of a national dialogue that kind of culminated in a conference which was fairly inclusive, but then eventually broke down because it didn't have the support from the international community that was required. The problem now is that there isn't a common position in the Gulf. There isn't a common position position in the international community of who should be represented. Even if you had all the parties around the table, there will always be loads of spoilers. And, there isn't an international community that could really rally around the flag when it comes to what they actually want in Yemen. So, again, the prospect is very bleak. And for the time being, most people are more concentrated on operational objectives on the ground rather than a comprehensive political and strategic solution.
Dr. Andreas Krieg there.